Okay, this is the lecture for Chapter 7, which is Business Ethics. I happen to think that this is one of the more important chapters that we will study in this course. I do know that it is offered as a full semester course in the business school. I'm not sure if it's offered every semester, but I would highly recommend it to you if it's something that you're interested in, because I feel that it's one of the few areas that you will actually study something and then you will take and apply what you've learned in your everyday business lives. So I highly recommend that. Ethics is an interesting subset of this course because there is no such thing as the law of ethics. Ethics instead is a study of what constitutes right and wrong behavior. It focuses on morality and the application of moral principles in everyday life. And then business ethics is a subset of that, of course, and that focuses on what constitutes ethical behavior in the business world. So it's not a separate kind of ethics, but it's a subset of the larger scope of ethics. Now, ethics starts at the personal level. So everyone has their own ethical principles, standards, belief system, value system, and those come from a variety of sources. They come from religion often, they come from the way that we are parented, the way we're raised, they come from some of the lessons that we'll learn in school, that we learn on the playground, that we just learn through our social interaction. So they're inherently personal to each of us. And I believe that in order to decide these issues of ethics, a person has to know first what his or her personal code of ethics is. What is it that you believe? How are you going to evaluate the decisions that you have to make, not just in the business world, but in your everyday personal lives? What is it that you use to guide your decision making in those areas? So one of the assignments that you have for this week, and it's actually not due for 2 weeks, but it is to develop a personal code of ethics. And that assignment takes you through doing some reflection and thinking about the things that you've learned, that the things that you believe, the behavior that you expect out of others, and the end of the exercise kind of synthesizes all those things into a statement of things that you will do or that guide you in your life. So usually students like that assignment a lot. I hope that you'll get a lot out of that. And I hope that you'll put a lot of thought into it because I think it's something that you'll be able to really have a personal takeaway from. So jumping into business ethics. Why is studying business ethics important? Well, it used to be that the theory of business and why you would run any business was to maximize profits. And of course, that's still a very important driving force in any business venture today. That is not totally outdated. But what you've seen in the last 25 years or so is the rise of corporate citizenship and the idea that a company can maximize profits while at the same time being a good citizen. And corporate citizenship kind of rose out of this idea that businesses are consumers of society, they're consumers of resources, and so they therefore should be responsible for giving back to society and for being responsible and contributing members of the same. And so we're going to talk a little bit later about how corporations advertise or decide what their roles should be when it comes to corporate social responsibility, and you'll have an assignment along those lines that I'll talk about when we get there to that point in the chapter. The importance of ethics in making business decisions. Well, if we're going to follow the twin goals of maximizing profits but also becoming good corporate citizens, then we have to look at any decision that we're faced with from different standpoints. We have to know what the legal implications are for any decision. We have to try to figure out what we think the public relations impact will be. We have to evaluate whether there are safety risks for consumers and for our employees. And of course, last but not least, we have to decide what the financial implications of each of the options that we have that we're evaluating. Um, there's a school of thought that says that in the long run, the consequences of unethical conduct cause profits to suffer. Bad publicity, lawsuits, trouble with regulatory agencies, turning off consumers, that those are inconsistent with long-run profit maximization. There's also, you should know, a school of thought that thinks that that is ridiculous. And so just know that there are, ethics is subjective. As a whole, ethics, of course, is looking at what society thinks is right or wrong behavior. But I'm not sure that if you tried to come up with some universal definition of what is right and what is wrong, we could agree on that. So I think that it's more helpful to look at ethics from the standpoint of, yes, there are some overarching societal ethical standards, but ethics are more specific to a region, to a group of people, to a company. And so in our everyday lives, the impact is much more on a personal and more local level. Another reason that we would want to make ethical business decisions, not just because that it would be consistent with long-run profit maximization, but because these days corporations have to be, any business has to be hyper aware of any PR damage or how their image is portrayed because of course, the internet. Any information, good news travels fast, but not near as fast as bad news. And so it's really difficult to hide anything these days, especially when it's talking about the consequences of corporate behavior. So reputations can be ruined faster and easier and quicker than they ever could before. And so making ethical decisions is important to make sure that you don't run afoul of the internet watchdogs, the people. The relationship of law and ethics, and that's why I say that's an interesting subset or focus of study in the business law course, is that what is ethical and what is legal are not the same thing. Just because something is legal does not mean it's ethical. And there are things that might be ethical that are illegal. So we cannot equate legality with being ethical. So keep that in mind. There's this idea of the moral minimum, and what that idea is that every business should, at a minimum, follow the law. And that as long as they're following the law, they're meeting that moral minimum. But ethics requires us to take that a step further. Not just that you are meeting that minimum compliance with the law, but that you're also evaluating your decisions, not just to whether they're legal, but whether they are right, whether they are moral, whether they are ethical. And that's where the idea of business ethics comes in, that is really over and above this legal minimum that you see. Corporations themselves often will develop and put forth their own codes of ethics, and those are not law, but they do help guide a company's philosophy. They help guide corporate decision-making, employee decision-making, and behavior. Some professional groups have ethical codes of conduct, like for attorneys, there are ethical rules of any lawyer that must be followed. The CPAs have their own standard of conduct, and so on and so forth. So it may not just be specific to a company, but it might be specific to a profession as well. Ethics is also not a black and white area. So not only does it differ between persons or companies or regions, but it is often, there's just some gray areas that are really hard to figure out what is and what isn't ethical. And so corporations, companies, anybody in the business world that gets caught up in a lawsuit, a company who has acted in good faith or responsibly or ethically, they're much more likely to prevail in those areas where the law is gray or the ethical areas are gray. Business ethics and social media is discussed in your book, and talks about how it used to be in the old days, and these days the old days could be 5 years ago. When you were applying for a job, you had to list references, and those folks would either get a letter or they get called on the telephone. These days, you still have to list references, but employers are much more likely to just Google you or look at your social media accounts as really better information than maybe one of your previous employers or a reference that you've handpicked to give them because you feel that they're going to be obviously a good reference for you. And so there's some folks think that judging candidates for jobs based on what they do outside of the work environment is unethical. The book also talks about, and this is, I'm not sure I buy into this, but that some businesses think if you don't have any social media presence, then that indicates some sort of red flag. And then the response to that is, of course, well, it's not ethical for you to discriminate against me because I don't have a social media presence. I think that there are good arguments to be made on both sides of that. I think it's interesting that if I'm an employer, I want to know what's going on with my employers or my job candidates. And if I am a candidate, then I feel like that I have the right to privacy, and I don't want my company or my future employer snooping around. But what's interesting about that to me is that it's either ethical or it's not ethical. It can't be ethical if you're the employer, but unethical if you're the employee. It's got to be one or the other. So I've made that our discussion question for this week. And I want you to evaluate how you feel about that from both the perspective of an employer and a job candidate, and then give me an idea of why you think that is ethical or unethical and support that with some reasons. So I'll look forward to hearing your thoughts on that, and if any of you have any personal experience from your employment that's relevant, I'd love to know about, if your business does that or if you have seen that be successful or unsuccessful for folks in your own experience. I will tell you that as an attorney, one of the first things I do with any prospective clients or any opposing parties or any other attorneys or anybody involved in my case, it might be a witness, we do a basic social media review of anything and everything that we can find. And it is so often the best source of background and information you can have in litigation. So I caution you as to what you make public and what you may put behind a password protected site, because one of the fastest ways that you can get in trouble either with your employer or in the legal area is to have some sort of objectionable content on your social media. So enough preaching on that. Approaches to ethical reasoning. This is just something for you to have just like a general idea of. There are a couple of questions in the quiz on this, and the reason I put them on there is just because I want you to know that there are different schools of thought within ethics. There is not one right or wrong way to look at any of these ideas, and so we're not going to get too deep into philosophy here. But I do want you to just appreciate that there are different schools of thought and kind of what the basic ideas in each one of those are. So one group of schools of thought is duty-based ethics. They're usually derived from religious authorities or philosophical reasoning. They're focused on concepts of right and wrong, duties that are owed, rights that are to be protected. Some examples of those are, of course, religious ethical principles. One that comes to mind is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And those are generally an absolute in terms of the outcome. There's some problems with with that approach is that if a company becomes too religious, or if their code of ethics um, bears too much religion, then that can be off-putting to employees of different religions, or it can cause publicity or protest or boycotts. And it can also engender some strong loyalty from customers as well. The Chick-Fil-A stance a few years ago against gay marriage comes to mind as an example of some religious ideas making its way into a company's code of ethics. Another area of duty-based ethics, or another idea, is the principle of rights. That is the idea that everyone has rights, and a key factor in determining whether a decision is ethical is how that decision affects the rights of others, and that would include employees, owners, shareholders, suppliers, the community, society as a whole, the environment. Now, obviously, a problem with that is, well, what happens when we have conflicting rights? Because the right of the owners to expect uh, maximization of profits conflicts with the right of the environment to not be harmed by a company. So when you have conflicting rights, um, the question becomes whose right takes priority. And the school of thought and the principle of rights doesn't really tell you how to resolve those conflicts. But one answer that has been used is whichever right is stronger in a particular circumstance takes priority. And of course, that is an entirely subjective exercise to determine that. So good luck with resolving conflicts that way. Another school of thought in duty-based ethics is Kantian ethical principles. And Immanuel Kant, of course, developed that. He believed that people should be respected because they are qualitatively different from other physical objects, and that he came up with this idea that you may be familiar with called the Categorical Imperative. And what that means is that individuals should evaluate their actions in light of the consequences that would follow if everyone acted the same way. Um, and that is a philosophical discussion for another day and another class. So, in contrast to duty-based ethics, another school of thought is outcome-based ethics, and this is usually falls under the category of utilitarianism. And this is much less of a touchy-feely analysis of moral values and religious beliefs as it is a kind of a more cold cost-benefit analysis. Under the utilitarianism school of thought, an action is morally correct or right when it produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of individuals. So applying this theory, requires a determination of who will be affected, a running of the numbers, so to speak, evaluation of what the outcomes would be, and then a choice among those alternatives as to what will produce the maximum societal utility. And a problem with that approach is that certainly we could see an act that produces the greatest good for the most, but that may not seem to be the most ethical. An idea that comes to mind to illustrate that is that with the COVID-19, you could make the argument that under a utilitarianism view, that just allowing everyone to go ahead and get COVID and acquire herd immunity would end up with the greatest amount of good for the greatest number. That obviously means that we have decided that everyone who doesn't die from it benefits from becoming immune to it, but we've got that subset of people who it kills. So I think that is certainly maybe a little bit of an extreme example, but one that sticks out as maybe a problem with that way of thinking. That brings us to corporate social responsibility. And this involves, of course, a corporation making a commitment to being a good citizen of the town where they are, the state where they are, the country where they are, of the world. You could look at it on many, many different levels. So many companies have adopted the idea of becoming good corporate citizens. And the cynic would say that they do that just for good PR, or because everybody else is doing it, and if they don't do it, then they are going to be behind. So many companies will publish annual reports on their corporate social responsibility, their sustainability, their citizenship, to kind of highlight their activities and their initiatives, how much money they've spent or donated in that area. Um, and so the idea, of course, for the non-cynic is that this increases goodwill. There's this idea that consumers do make decisions about the products that they buy or the companies that they invest in based on whether those companies are good citizens or not. The stakeholders that have to be evaluated when you're looking at corporate social responsibility, we kind of mentioned these earlier when we were talking about the different constituencies that would have to be considered: employees, customers, creditors, suppliers, advocacy groups, the community, the environment, your owners, your shareholders, the regulatory agencies, the law. So there are a lot of different aspects of that. One of your assignments, one of your 3 ethics assignments, is to Google a corporate social responsibility report of a company. And it's not hard to find at all. If you just Google that, you'll find ones for many different companies. And so what I've asked you to do in that assignment is evaluate that company's report. Do you believe that what they are saying is just for good PR, or do you believe that they really are sincerely invested in this idea of being a good citizen? Are there things in these reports that you're surprised are in there, that you didn't know about those companies before? Does reading that report change the way you think about purchasing that company's products or buying that company's stock? So those are things I want you to think through, and I'd like for you to do it with a critical eye. Put in that assignment that I don't want any cutting and pasting. I'm not interested in what the reports say. I'm interested in what you think about what the reports say and what your analysis of it is. So do a critical dive on these things and turn something in that shows that you've really thought through and that you've looked at this thing through a critical lens. Let me know what you think. So that is the second one of the second of the 3 ethics assignments that I've assigned to you. Making ethical business decisions, a framework for making ethical business decisions. You know, this is as much common sense as anything you'll find. You know, I suggest in your 3rd ethics assignment, which is a case study of the Malden Mills company located in Massachusetts, and it's an older case study, but still relevant in terms of the decisions that the company had to make following a devastating fire to its mill. And the central question is really should the owners have rebuilt the mill in this town where they'd been for 100 years and where they were the major economic driver of the community, or should they go and rebuild in a place with cheaper labor, cheaper costs, that would perhaps create a better bottom line for the company? And so what is their responsibility to their employees, to this town, and to their owners? So it's a good case study. And the way that you'll go through it is that it wants you to look at and this is a suggested framework for any ethical decision making. 1, gather all the facts, decide what groups will be affected, what stakeholders do you have that will be affected by this decision. And so don't limit your inquiry into just owners versus employees. Look at suppliers, look at the town, look at local governments, look at the region, look at the other businesses that might be affected, your suppliers or someone either up the supply chain or down the supply chain, and kind of make a list of what all groups will be affected. And then you've got to analyze, of course, what are your options? What are the things that you can do? And then you've got to go back and evaluate for each option how that will affect each group. And then you would, of course, want to involve the relevant decision makers. You want to consult the appropriate people or representatives as you debate and decide what decision you're going to make. And then you can look at the options from all these different perspectives from ethics. It doesn't hurt to, you might not be a proponent of one school of thought, but it doesn't hurt to look at them through each lens. So, for example, what option will produce the most good and do the least harm? What's the utilitarian solution to this problem? Economic consequences. What are the legal requirements? Will everyone's rights and dignity still be respected? What rights are we talking about for each group of stakeholders? What option is the most fair? And then once you make your decision, I always think it's helpful to say, okay, well, if I had to explain this decision on television, would I be comfortable doing that? So it's got to be something that you could, that you wouldn't be afraid to say with a straight face, and that you would put up for public scrutiny. So then, of course, you would implement and then evaluate your decision after it's made. So that's a framework that I propose that you use for any ethical decisions that you may have. And that is the one that I want you to go by in the ethics assignment that you're going to be doing over the next 2 weeks. That concludes our ethics lecture. So I'm going to sign off now and start again and talk agency.